we're specifically going to be looking at today is this idea of lay stakeholders. So those who do not possess any professional or technical knowledge or policy knowledge for that matter, but they have a situational and contextualized lived experience that informs how they experience these harms, which can then help potentially solve some blind spots in these traditional top-down, expert-driven methods. So the method that we use to actually engage these lay stakeholders, we term scenario building. And you might know this term by many, many other names. It goes by sci-fi writing, science fiction writing, speculative fiction, speculative design, what-if scenarios, predictive scenarios, the list goes on. But at the core of this process is that we use these scenarios, these short stories, to transform complex information, and in our world, complex harms, into these narrativized short stories that are easy to understand, and it can immediately contextualize the harm so people, especially those without that expert knowledge, can understand what it looks like in their lives, what it might look like in their families' lives, and in their day-to-day. So for this work, we focused on a subset of harms from our previous work that was published at AIS last year, looking at harms within generative AI in the media ecosystem. And so we're presenting these harms in a scenario-driven format, and we're using those scenarios from this previous work. And these harms can take the form of things like political manipulation, sensationalism in the media, or even addiction in regards to generative AI content. And so these scenarios that we're using that are depicting these small set of harms were generated by GPT-4 and then validated by a human author team to make sure they're actually representing the harms that we want to see present. And then these are also looking just short-term in the future, so about 5 years in the future, and in a predominantly US context. So in our work, we are developing a participatory approach that supports policymaking, importantly not replacing by any means. We're looking to boon and add to this method that can integrate these broader stakeholders and these broader ideas and democratic values of stakeholders. So step one is we're consulting with these stakeholders and asking them to identify different mitigation approaches, to identify different ways to potentially mitigate these harms, then engage them in a prioritization task, and finally use large language modeling to transform these really rich data sets of what they want and their needs and values into policy fact sheets that can actually assist policymakers with understanding these democratic expectations. So step one, actually identifying those mitigation strategies. So we had a survey through Prolific with about 40 participants, and we were using those scenarios to contextualize the harms and then asking them to brainstorm some mitigation techniques in the form of who should do what. And this is how we term stakeholder-action pair. And so we're asking them, list as many as you can, think of different ways that you would want to see this harm solved in policy or in your society, and they come up with these SAPs, as we call them. And then this actually resulted in more than 400 different mitigation approaches that were in the form of these stakeholder action pairs. And after some data cleansing and data consolidation, this went down to about 230 unique pairs across these 10 individual harms. And we had 12 different top-level stakeholders. The top 3 were government, tech companies, and news publishers. Though there's a wide margin of different stakeholders, some only came up once or twice, such as unions and NGOs. Some were more in the middle of the pack, such as schools or even social media companies. And then the actions were much more diverse, and we distilled these down into 41 distinct actions across these 10 harms and across these 12 stakeholders. And the top actions we saw were fact-checking, improving digital literacy, and transparency, though these actions took very, very diverse means, and they even took diverse terms of granularity and abstraction. So we even saw things like financially incentivizing employers to not using AI in their work, limiting who had access to these models, predominantly students in that way, limiting how students had access, and then even things like developing a licensing scheme to ensure that newsrooms who are using AI have a license to do so. But what does it really matter if a lot of people came up with the idea that doesn't necessarily translate to the fact that they want to see it enacted in policy? So next we engaged them in a prioritization task, and we had a different subset of users for this. We had about 90 users looking at those same scenarios, narrativizing the harms, and then they're actually looking at how much do they agree and how much they prioritize these SAPs that were come up with in the previous study. So we transformed these stakeholder action pairs into should statements. So things like news publishers should ban AI to write news stories. So a stakeholder should do an action. And then we asked them to rank these in terms of agreement and prioritization and how much in terms they wanted to see this in policy and how much they thought it needed to be in policy. And so across the board, people thought that most of these stakeholder action pairs should occur. And again, we had almost 230 of these, and people really just wanted to see them all implemented in policy in some way. And like I was saying, there's a similar trend with how common these were brainstormed, but not necessarily one-on-one. So there were some unique stakeholder action pairs that were only brainstormed by one person and only in one harm, but we saw that it was across the board very wanting to see it implemented in policy, thought it was very high priority and had really high agreement scales. And so It's also important to note that this was done in a US context, so some of the trends we saw were very Americanized, such as people didn't want bans or limits. Whenever those words appeared in stakeholder action pairs, they predominantly fell to the bottom of these rankings. People didn't want to see, and people did not think it was a high priority. And I think we can all agree that probably wouldn't happen in other contexts, such as the European context. But within this Americanized context, people wanted much more lenient policy in regards to bans and limits. And then we also saw some interesting trends occur within these stakeholder action pairs. So things like fake news. People did not want fake news, but they wanted different ways to prevent it. So they tasked social media companies with preventing the spread of fake news, and then they tasked tech companies and media publishers preventing the creation of fake news, and then different various government agencies to punish people who made it, people who spread it, and people who consumed it sometimes. So again, these weren't necessarily implementable policy, but it was what people wanted to see reflected in their policy legislation. So now we're going to transform this information in actually usable method for policymakers and different policy aides and different stakeholders in that realm to actually use this rich data set to their advantage and understand what stakeholders want. So we term these policy fact sheets, which we use GPT-4o to create in tandem with our author team, heavily validating and iteratively working on this process with an expert on policy on our team to transform these rich data sets into short and digestible summarizations of what people wanted to see. So things like the high priority, high consensus actions, things people didn't find desirable, and what lay stakeholders found to be really important in their needs and values, and that could be reflected back in policy. And it's important to note that this is not meant at all to replace policy. It's not meant to replace these experts, but rather enrich these expert-driven methods, and so people that understand how to implement these things in a more nuanced and cost-balanced way, but so they can understand what their constituencies actually wanted represented in the policy. And so we envision this being really useful at especially a local level. So places like local Chicago governments have already implemented participatory budgeting to grab a consensus of their constituencies to see what they want to reflect in their budget, and we could see this being implemented in a similar way to see what they want in their local legislation. This could also be useful for legislative aides, think tanks, and different auditing agencies to understand what they want reflected in their policy. So in summation, we developed an inclusive approach to inform policymaking, again, not replace it, to assist with policymaking that utilizes the inputs from lay stakeholders. And this really does support a vital societal need to integrate more diverse voices in policy. These are all very expert-driven approaches, and we want to find a way to integrate more democratic constituent bases reflected in these policies so they can see their own needs and reflected back to them. And some future work is to actually simulate the effects of these perceived policy that was being implemented based on these stakeholder action pairs, so we can see how people actually perceive differences in the severity of the harms based on how these policies were implemented, and then integrate this actually into practice in pipelines, specifically at local government offices. So thank you so much for your time. Reach out to any of me or my collaborators if you have any further questions.